Today's conference at 20 past 6. It's an open session, and this is a session well conceived as a celebration of a very important book for the architects, but also all of us, last 50 years from learning from Las Vegas, and it's going to be organized in a couple of times. First time, it's like a dialogue between 4 speakers who will read part of the book and some interpretation from different points of view. And then we have a preview, a brief presentation of an exhibition which is entitled Traveling with Denise. The different speakers I'm going to introduce for the first part of the session, which is this dialogue, is Eva Alvarez from the Polytechnic University of Valencia, Carolina Vaccaro from the Temple University of Rome, and Pia Fontana from the University of Girona, and Miguel Mayorga from the Polytechnic University of Catalonia. So the structure of this part of the meeting, this dialogue, is made with an alternance between 6 brief presentations that will open some Q&A that we will face during the debate with the public. So I will now give the floor to Eva Alvarez to start this dialogue. And should anything happen, don't hesitate to ask questions. You can raise your hand with the button that you find here of raising your hand, or you can write your comments in the chat, comments or questions in the chat. Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a great unexpected pleasure to open this part of the conference. Of course, it's a great honor to be here and to make reference to someone and to a book, to a group of people who are essential in the history of architecture and history of culture. I'm an architect and I work with Carlos Gómez, as we have seen before, and often we face something which is very well described in the book, which is what cannot be quantified, what goes beyond your capacity. So Carlos and myself are very much into photography and astronomy. I was born in the island of La Palma, so I feel very close to the author when she talks about landscape as different ways of forming one's character. When one sees something as impressive as the sky with the adequate equipment to watch it, one knows that you can do it with precision and you require of instruments which are very precise. Some of them are domestic and we take them everywhere, but they can be very well organized from an institutional perspective, as we can see in the background telescopes in the island of La Palma. When Denise Scott Brown and her masters in UPenn say, why don't you visit places where people go and try to understand the reasons, which is something that as architects, we ask ourselves, but this is not what we were invited to do in our schools. One wonders which type of instruments can you use to watch this, which is very difficult to quantify. Impossible to quantify, which is the word that she uses more often. However, it's full of people, incredible for us architects. It's full of people and things happen. And it's quite impressive that during the 60s, Scott Brown looks at the eyes of Sequilla and she prepares the adequate tools in order to be able to analyze it. So these different tools come from her trajectory, from her life, from her busy life when she arrived in here. And in the year 1966, when she was contributing to the curriculum of architecture at the University of California, almost during the first exercise that she was able to direct, she was talking about forms, strengths, and function. So including in all these texts, which is all memorable, how can we work as far as the environment and how it is urgent that architecture and urban development are related and how we should understand the political, the social, and the economic issues, which is fundamental in order to approach this project. These words continue to be of current importance, and this is why we have approached this work not only as architects who should know the best things which have been written so far, but also because we need the tool in order to work. During this training course in 1966, they already mentioned from architecture to urban design. And we also see the relation of Denise Scott Brown with Esther McCoy, who introduced her to the LA, Las Vegas, and traffic. And she was involved in all these subjects and she was dealing with them for many years. When they see Las Vegas, they start to consider not only the subject, which is already enough of finding, but to elaborate the different instruments. This plan reminds me of the night sky in La Palma, trying to look for other qualities of the space, which are very much different to the ones that we see in the schools of architecture, and make a leap forward from a theoretical perspective, relating it to the Norbit plan of Norbit Barroco. Here we see the intensity of the public space, cars which are parked, the use of private and public spaces in a new language, in a new way of seeing, that she's trying to see the city from another perspective with another tool. And all these knowledge are translated into a different sphere. For us, this is quite a finding when we approach learning from Las Vegas. So in front of a problem which is difficult to quantify, they find a new language to try to explain this reality. So in the strip, we see how to count the importance of these signs as far as the intensity of the lighting. When we were studying and approaching the problem from the gender perspective, which is the field in which we work, we feel very much helped by these plans by Denise Scott Brown that she developed in Fairmount, for example, during this project in which she's studying this cultural landscape of Philadelphia, where we see how she combines different variables such as transportation, use of the territory, and use of the space. But she also analyzes other variables which nowadays will be difficult to study: the percentage of Black population divided by age, young people, old people, and according to family income. And here we can see the different consequences that we can imagine. People of a Black race live in places with lower income, and the population is younger. So it's a way of placing on the table all the economic and social questions which are going to configure the architectonic project. So these are some of the examples, part of this project. And we see that she uses quite a simple language, creating categories from soft to hard, hot and cold, in order to see when is it possible to reform and how difficult it is to reform, or where there is a social petition as far as the change. With very simple plans, we can be able to quantify all this. We also see repeatedly in a different way of talking about the daily life and to overlap different variables. And from this point of view, the point of view that we are introducing and exhibiting all this from the perspective of gender perspective, the inclusion, social relationships. So we go back to the beginning of the and functions of the territory, which somehow in. Well, that's it so far. This is what I wanted to say more or less during the first part of my introduction. I guess that now we will listen to Miguel. Miguel, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you for your kind invitation. Yes, we are making like a synthesis of many things. And I really like what Eva was explaining, because somehow it's related to two reflections that we are going to mention. Maria Pia and myself are going to talk about things which are related to the construction of this complex gaze by Denise. Maria Pia is going to speak about photography as an instrument, and I will speak a little bit about something which is quite interesting, and I've been interested in this for a long time because I've been studying Denise Scott Brown, because my doctoral thesis was talking about the spaces of urban centrality and streets. And then I'm interested in talking about how to make streets in order to make cities, something as basic as this. We talk about public spaces, and in the public spaces, many people are thinking that we are thinking about the plazas or the parks, and this is the public space in the street. So what I want to show here is, of course, that Denise is making a work which is very much related to this methodology and this approach and this gaze, where the street, it's a fundamental instrument, not only in the analysis, but also in the project. So we can talk about the relationship inside and outside of the definition or proposals of different patrons and patterns, and the mixture between the anthropological and topological perspective, and see how Denise, from the different perspectives that she develops during her work in her office in charge of the urban scale projects. So before everything, let me remind you the times during which Denise from Las Vegas appears. She appears at the moment, and this is a work made by Jean Gell, where she tries to compile the different books that talk about the urban vitality related to the public space. And we see that there is a period where we see in Learning from Las Vegas many reflections which are intertwined. We can talk about Jane Deports, we can talk about Rose, and we can talk about Learning from Las Vegas. But we also have David Lynch, Christopher Alexander also, or Donald Appeyat. So these are a series of publications and research works which try to understand the public space and the street space. So this is a sentence used by Denise when she talks about the public space. She's asking functional for whom. So this question is facing us to the problem. If the public space for whom, or who is the public space, or whether the public space is whatever has been built or the relationships established in these public spaces. So if we talk about the street, we could understand that we come from some logics of disciplinary division, where each one of the disciplines have to interrelate and interact on the projects and the management of the streets, and they end up using this idea of everything as a whole. On the one hand, the engineer and the transportation, the architect and the landscape. So this is something that we have seen and has been reported by Jen Decos. But what is instrumental here is this idea of transportation with its own logics, and this can be composed as time goes by. So we see the different examples of this. So making streets, so this is the great subject, as Eva was saying before, and with the products by Fremont, green spaces, the correlations established there, and these different spaces making up an area of a city are the relationships. And these relationships, we can understand that we can say from architecture that we are quite well prepared to understand urban forms and patterns, but often we are not trained to understand the relations between these urban patterns. So this is something that Nuno Portas was saying. He was saying that we should be interested not only in things, but the relationship among things. So trying to go back to making streets is related to this, is related to understand things which are difficult to quantify, and which are not related to width, height, and depth of things, but with the intensity of the use of spaces, where we gather many people, although the streets have the same section. I really like this project of Washington Avenue, where they try to speak about revitalization. They talk about the street as a building. The street includes parks, corners, and it's a super structure of a city. The same analysis that she's making, and she's helping us to see these relationships between streets and paths from a different scale, the intensity of use, the population, and functions, as she was saying before. And also we are reading, identifying, and working with patterns, promoting then from different topologies, forms as buildings, which are maybe streets, are the projects of Smithson were proposing, or maybe the projects by Can, where we cannot forget that the association of different spaces are generating interior streets. Same projects where Denise has already said that she learned together with We Can, because in reality, with We Can, because they were participating in a very intense and rich debate where one was learning from another, from understanding the city, understanding the occupation of the public space, and understanding also basic notions such as centrality, centrality as a meeting point, which was very helpful in order to understand that these relationships, in the case of these projects which are related to these projects, we should understand where we want this centrality to happen. And in order to understand this centrality, which is a variable notion and is not a limited space, we have to understand this series of instruments that were part of its own interdisciplinary training coming from economy and other aspects. So here we have then the Noli plans as an instrument of work in order to establish interior streets, which are the ones structuring our projects in a way that what I wanted to highlight here is that this analysis is materializing the project, because often the mapping, if it stays just as a mapping, is not instrumental and is not producing a solution, so it stops having some usefulness. And it's precisely recognizing in the work of this Denise Scott Brown this logic of trying to understand the street as an external space, an internal space as an structuring element of the city and the buildings. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Okay, so I'm now going to share your screen and you can start.
Okay. Okay.
Done.
Perfect. Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me in this celebration of Learning from Las Vegas, a celebration of Denise Scott Brown that I want to thank also and greet. Thank to Denise for all we learned from her. Mine is just, a number of slides. I will speed very much to understand some of the premises, some of the precedents to this that led to the research of Las Vegas. Okay, next. So this, the title, Almost Everything, wants to explain the many and multiple sources of their work and their theory. When I say there, of course, I refer also to Bob Venturi. And learning from everything led them to a kind of holistic view. As Martino Stierli underlines, the modern movement was selective. They started to be holistic. This change has been progressive. And they started an evolution from the ought to the is. In embryo, the research by image by Denise Scott Brown started to look in this direction. And finally, it was a search for the American identity. Next. Okay, thank you. To understand, yes, to understand the circular perspective of Denise Scott Brown, and to be aware, you know, of the capacity to link all her experience and, you know, thoughts, we have to be aware about her backgrounds. Of course, Denise Scott Brown born and grown up as a teenager in South Africa, and then she moved in Europe, studying at the Architectural Association in London, and then in the United States, where she established and teach at University of Pennsylvania, and she established the firm with Robert Venturi. Okay. Next. So the question was the research of American identity. And I always like to quote Denise's phrase, what's American about American place? And this was in the air during the 60s, also because there was, you know, as you see the book on the left, this book, God's Own Junkyard, was a kind of debate that was on the aesthetic of the contemporary city. In the 60s, architects and theoreticians regarded the increasing decentralization and suburbanization of the city with perplexity and disapproval. And in a way, the research on Las Vegas attempted to find answer to these questions and focused on the commercial Las Vegas Strip, regarded as represented the aesthetics of urban sprawl in its purest and extreme form as an archetype. Next. An important encounter for Denise Scott Brown was the encounter with Alison and Peter Smithson at the Architectural Association in London. And I like to think also that Alison and Peter Smithson, their joint creativity is absolutely similar to the one of Denise and Robert Venturi. Their outsider view, and she comments, just as I, an African, and just as the one of Robert Scott Brown, her first husband, and or the one of Rem Koolhaas, who grew up in Indonesia as a teenager, we have the vantage to be out of the traditional culture, to be out of the traditional education, which mostly establish a distance between education and reality. Alison and Peter Smithson were part of the independent group, mass culture and pop art precursor, and their attitude, of course, was breaking the rules and searching for a new objectivity to relate architecture to social realism. So if you look very straight at a problem, writes Denise, the solution you find may be ugly, but the ugliness may be right. And they were functionalists for moral and aesthetic reason. There's a moral case for this argument, again, quoting Denise, but there's an aesthetic one too. Looking objectivity at problems, consider the merits of ugly, but effective solution can help to escape from aesthetic roots. Next. The important further step was teaching at the UPenn, University of Pennsylvania in America, in Philadelphia. Here she met Bob Venturi in the 1960s, and here she led a seminar, a very important seminar, Form, Forces, and Function, where the theory was that the form of the city owes as much to forces within the natural environment, society, and its technology as it does to function as architects define them. This was very important because it introduced the dynamic aspect in the urban research. And here at UPenn, she met Herbert Gans, the author of the sociologist, the author of the book Popular Culture and High Culture, who invited to learn to match aught of architectural ideas with ease of reality, evolving a design system from within rather than imposing one from above. And Denise writes that in a way, the goal was to rethink how to be an architect. Next. Her seminar of Form, Forces, and Function anticipate the question, the topic of the speed. And here we arrive to Ed Ruscha, that the group of the Learning from Las Vegas studio in the 68 meet in Los Angeles. Edward Ruscha was influential during the 60s and very influential for Learning from Las Vegas, both sides, we could say. He analyzed the American city and car-oriented urban landscape perceived through photography. He documented the banal and everyday reality. Same as Denise Scott Brown and Robert Turi treated the city in Learning from Las Vegas as a found object that primarily had to be documented and described. The deadpan attitude, and as Denise's uses deadpan to specify way of viewing and documenting a visual environment. Next. Here are some other images of the photograph, the motorized photograph by Ed Ruscha. Next. And so the speed topic was become absolutely central, and the space start to relate to the question of the dynamic. Due to their static quality, traditional representational technique were an obstacle to understanding the form of contemporary city. New analytic technique must use film and videotape to convey the dynamism of sign architecture and the sequential experience of vast landscapes, right, Denise? Central goals was to obtain an understanding of the automobile-oriented city. Next. From here, a necessary new theory of architectural communication with a different scale and with a dynamic topic, involving the dynamic topic. This is an image of the 1966 of Los Angeles. Next. Again, some images by Denise Scott Brown of Los Angeles. And here again, one of the last of Los Angeles. Next. So learning from Las Vegas or searching for an archetype, the main impulse, as Steerley writes, comes from Denise Scott Brown. In 65, she left for the West Coast to teach at the University of California and studied the automobile city of the American Southwest. In 66, she invited Bob Venturi to take part of their first joint exploration of the desert city. And the cultural significance of learning from Las Vegas thus lay in the way in which it oriented architecture toward the aesthetic of the American popular culture from below. Next. Here we see some maps of the book. This is an original slide from Denise's lectures, and it's very interesting how she relates this unconventional structure of the city was investigated in a way, having as a reference traditional city, the Nolli map. And the reason is easy to understand because Nolli draw the public building in plan and the private one in black. So you give this further information, looking at the map to understand the flow and the activity of the people in the city. Next. Here some other map, you know, investigation to the scale of communication by building type. Next. And here there's some comparative activity patterns. Next. And the analysis of the relationship between scale, speed, and symbol, using also some reference that, of course, were traditional European ancient building as the Cathedral of the Triumphal Arch. Next. Or another page from Las Vegas, learning from Las Vegas, where, you know, the sign of the casino is analyzed in terms of different layers of scale, finally arriving to the duality of the decorated shed and the duck. Next. And so she started to document Las Vegas through this number of photography. And in the 1966 came out this exhibition, the cover, as you see on your left, the signs of life, symbols in the American city, a research on what makes a house look like a house or a school look like a school, and a forest of signs. This is the end of the first part.
All right. Well, I'd like to just join to what has been said by my predecessors. I'd like to thank you all for inviting me. It's a luxury to be here around you. And I see that there are coincidences and repetitions, and this will help the debate and the dialogue. Carolina, would you mind muting your microphone, please?
Me? Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. See, yes, thank you very much. So when we were talking with Miguel about how to approach this topic, how to explain what Denise had showed us, because in the end, it's all about learning from her and making her vision contemporary. What we wanted to stress is the idea to take his learnings and see how this is implemented in a project. So Miguel represented this. He represented the project in the street, and this helps learn how to make a street somehow, and it's all inspired in Las Vegas, and there's the idea of urban spaces, which is quite different from the traditional point of view. And then the photographic view, this we thought was very suggestive, not only because of the exhibition that we're going to launch next year when the situation allows for that, but also the idea of this presentation that I would like to make here is how to relate photography as a tool for the project, and how easy it is to see everything that Denise is looking at is related to the way she interprets life. So I'm taking this quotation from a conference that we attended at the University of Lisbon, and she appeared there with her pink eye bag, and she appeared amongst the participants in the conference, and she made a speech for half an hour. It was a conference within the conference, and one of the things that we would like to underline here is that learn to see and to break your own examples when you see your own reality. And this is one of the sentences that we find most contemporary. Here I have just gathered a series of quotes, and this is related to the idea to how to interpret reality through photography, or how to interpret reality in order to better implement your project. When I was a child, my art professor told me that we couldn't be objective. We always had to learn from what was surrounding us, and this is very much to do with what's can't apparently be seen. In a very recent interview that I discovered by Peter Barbary, who's a curator, photography curator at the Sibley Center in Philadelphia, she referred to this photography and she said that Cartier-Bresson saw what nobody was looking at. This was a celebration for a parade that was organized to pay tribute to the Queen Elizabeth, and nobody saw the guy that was there beneath. So, people uh, were just focusing on something, and what may be ordinary becomes extraordinary. And this is a topic that is quite recurrent. And here we have a sentence. And if you are interested in the photography of Denise Scott Brown, you will be quite familiar with this quote. And it's the world where she explains here that she is not a photographer. Um, she's at the service of architecture. She shoots for architecture. So whatever she sees and whatever she takes a picture of is an instrument for her to better understand reality. So this is also one of the ideas that catches our eye. We don't know whether to hate or love something, but she says, don't think about it, just shoot. So, and this is what happens when we think about how to represent reality through photography, how we can show all of this. And these are sentences that Denise was using as a synthesis of her own thoughts. And she always talks about the relative aspect of things and the multi-scaled rather than human scaled, accommodating rather than constricting, and revelatory rather than representing. So this is something that comes from her. Or, there's also this sentence here that you see in the screen, and it's quite interesting. It's by Robert Venturi, when he recognizes that the interest for Las Vegas and for what's ordinary stems from the interest in pop art and traveling, and the importance of the ordinary and the importance of multiculturalism, because her very own life was based upon that. Here we have her two books, and this is the first one is by Venturi and the other one is by both of them. So there's certain topics that they both shared, and it's quite interesting when you read these books and all those interviews. When she strengthens the idea of what's complex versus to what is simple, and trying to mix things instead of just trying to simplify them. And there's a series of topics here that were interesting for both, and they agreed upon all of this, and they tried to research much more to have this complete view on all of those topics. And now Carolina had already mentioned certain things about this and about Vegas, but what's interesting in this way to approach photography and urban life is these two visions that she uses. She uses the worm's eye view and the mobilized view. This idea is this idea of the car as a main character in the American lifestyle, and it's the car as a symbol, really. This is something that could be a matter of criticism, but it's quite representative. And then there's this view on the city. And after several years of having published Learning from Las Vegas, well, then in 2008, they both discovered that they have lots of archives on Vegas, and they decide to put up a new book, and they decide to move from a compilation document to an artistic document. So photographies here are brought to life, and they're and they are dissociated from the pedagogic experience and from the training experience. This is just pictures from Vegas, and they just try to build this book with all those pictures, reusing the materials that they had gathered and that were archived. And this is the view of Carolina, and it's interesting to see all these coincidences and this repetition of topics. It's again the idea of the warm eye view and the mobilized view. This is the mobilized view. It's dynamic. It's what you can see through a car. And this is something that becomes mixed and they influence each other. And here we find this idea of the collage in the street, and this is reflected through the photographic view. And here, simply 4 pictures that are very suggestive to me. And I think that Jeremy Tenenbaum will talk about one of those pictures later on. And I'm sure that, well, he will be together with us at the launch of the exhibition in Girona. And there's the importance of the ordinary aspects of common life and how Denise's view can interpret all of this. We can see here the patterns of these pigeons in Venice, and we can see here how certain patterns are drawn through the experience of these photographers in Africa. And this very image, she says here, there's this infinite space, but there's always elements to give you reference. And in this case, we're talking about the skyline of Venice with Piazza San Marco over there. And here we can see also the advertisements all scattered, but they give an idea of a unitary image. So it's a sum of symbols, a sum of elements that are apparently scattered and fragmented and not related to each other, but they end up building the image of a city or the image of a street. And this is a curiosity that I found in this article with Jason Fulford. It's an article by the director of the Steglis Gallery, and here we have a picture of the house of Denise Scott Brown, and she built her own home by adding elements. It's a sum of different elements. And now to finish, we're thinking with Miguel how to relate all this photographic view to urban life and to our project. And that is, well, how urban life and people are reflected in photographies. So since we didn't have much time, I just wanted to make reference to 3 projects that we have studied quite in depth. And this is the fields in the United States. Here we can see some images, and obviously you cannot read, but sorry, it's the campuses of different areas. And we have here the campus in Philadelphia, in Michigan, and Providence. And these are 3 elements. And the archive of Venturi by Denise Scott Brown allows to download all these pictures and projects. So you can reconstruct all of this. And it has really helped us understand our fundamental topic, this photographic view. And it's this importance of this morphologic and topologic view. And here we have this overlapping of different plans that we have used in order to research on these campuses. And we here have moved from the morphologic view to the topologic view. That makes appear something else. It makes appear the way people live and the way people flow and the way people move and relate to each other. And this produces centralities, humanities, and new focuses. And this is very much related to the way university students live in the campuses. And this is very contemporary because there's all this debate on how the campus and the city can coexist together and can get closer to each other. And here I'm using this image as a tribute to Juan Genovese, the Spanish painter who passed away a few months ago. And this reminds us the idea of the citizen and the people. And this is a fundamental topic to make us understand for whom we're making a city. And this is something that Denise Scott Brown had already thought very much about. For whom we're making the city. And this is very much related to topics such as participation and gender equality. And this is part of our contemporaneity. And basically, we can still refer to it. We can learn a lot from it in a very constructive way. And I'm going to close my talk just repeating what she used to say some time ago. She was referring to this capacity that we must have as architects to break these views when we are facing reality, because reality is giving us the pattern to understand and to interpret what we feel. Thank you very much. Thank you. To continue with this format, we see that lots of ideas are repeated. First of all, again, it is my privilege to be here within this expert group. And about the gender perspective, I would like to mention that this is also, I would like to relate this topic to photography. And now before, and this is not easy to measure, we could see the enormousness, and we feel this, the very same impression when we approach the territory. And when we approach this territory from the force of nature and also the economic forces and whatever is related to people, even though, well, then there is not this infinite character of the sky, but I have to say that there are certain topics that can be analyzed. This is a view of La Palma, the island of La Palma, that we like visiting for holidays, but it's difficult to recognize all the diversity of the terrain. There are lots of things to be discovered there. In Architectural Forum in 1968, Vega's analysis was presented. It was the first time that this was presented to the public. And we can see that there is something that we feel very close to. And it says that learning from the existing landscape is a revolutionary way to look at things. It's looking at whatever is existing already, but looking at it in a more tolerant way. So the issue, after all, is how we look at things. And this is what Pia was saying right now. How do we look at things? And we feel very close to this question, Carlos and I, because when you want to incorporate the gender perspective at the School of Architecture, and when you want to approach different solutions or to analyze things from a different point of view, well, you have to face many different issues and problems and complaints. So in learning from Las Vegas, we find that try to dig in this matter, we find a new way of working. This picture has been used in many different exhibitions, but how can we translate this into different plans and standards, and how to translate all of this so that our documents, the documents we produce, involve part of what was happening. So how can we get there? This plan, for instance, this view is a different view. And here we have the scheme underneath. And regarding this problem, if instead of trying to understand and learn from Vegas, if we try to understand and learn from the use people make of the territory, we see that we remain in the same problem. So learning from Las Vegas not only gives us a view on the object and on things that are not seen, but learning from Las Vegas also gives us tools and mechanisms and critical positions on what to do. A way to get tools from photography and video. Here we have lots of texts by Denise Scott-Brown, where she explains how to represent it, what she could see in Las Vegas. And photography was just one mechanism, but it was an irreplaceable mechanism. But not only photography, as it was said before, but systematic photography to translate not only the sensation that is produced by electricity and the big signposts, but also photography that depicts the immensity of the desert, of the landscape that surrounds us. So how to translate this into other documents or into other environments? And learning from Las Vegas is a handbook on how to approach reality. Today, I am still amazed by learning from Las Vegas. I'm amazed by the imagination, by creativity. I find certain things that, well, we may find a bit more usual today, but to me, they still look extraordinary. And all these pictures translate so many ideas. There are so many documents that can be useful for people who make decisions. And it's not only filming and shooting from the car or showing the windscreen, such as Dennis Hopper did in many photographs, but also to introduce this, to explain that impression, or for instance, leaving very early in the morning in order to photograph people getting in and out of their jobs. And this is surprising because today we see all this work that has been acknowledged already, but at the beginning, well, some photographies, photographies by Rousset were just prior to those by Denise Scott-Brown. And I have to say that the artistic production was a tool that Scott-Brown used very much, and she used that constantly, and we can use it today ourselves as a tool. And here we have here a reinterpretation of the work by Rousset. But Rousset, well, the pictures that he has are 3 or 4 years earlier than what we're used to seeing. So he's very much um, up to date. I don't know what we should do today in order to produce such an equivalent thing that of this piece of work. And to me, I would say that he is an impulsor for Denise Scott Brown. And here we see how they keep working with photographies in order to communicate. Again, communication, this is also another element that comes up in the book. It's not only writing, but communicating through architecture and amongst architects in order to translate our everyday life to whatever cannot be measured. And this is not only specific terrain for architects, it's about trying to reflect what is tangible. And this is a topic that is very close to our daily life. Here we see the work related to publicity, which is not so common at the School of Architecture. And it's also surprising to see the position that Scott Brown took and uh, how strong she was when advocating for her ideas. In 1951, if we understood correctly, Casabella is published. This is a review published by the School of Architectural Studies in New York. And she writes this article, Learning from Pop. And again, she is using some pictures that she took from Los Angeles and Vegas. And she's using, again, the same argument for formal analysis in her research for design. And once more, she keeps giving us tools constantly, tools and thoughts and critical positions to see what cannot be seen normally. And she says that actually here Frampton, this is a reply to Frampton by Denise Scott Brown. And to me, I still think that she has a remarkable position. And it's very important that one is able to defend its own position and to clarify. And I really invite you to read this text. It's a spectacular text when it comes to defending Roger's work. And of course, I admire the work by Venturi and Scott Brown. I think they're both an example to follow, not only because of their own role and position and the capacity to see things and to look at things, but also the tools that they produced from an intellectual point of view. And today we're celebrating this 50th anniversary on the publication of this research that comes from a way to look at things that was cultivated through a biography that encompasses and embraces everyday life and the approach to the world of art and architectural theories of the highest level. And here we're facing two different issues. This is the new object of study that really helps us. It's about giving some dignity to an object of study, which is everyday life, and giving us tools to approach something that is not easy to approach. So, Carolina and Jeremy, please mm, tell Denise how grateful I am for her work and tell her that she has lots of supporters in Valencia. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Here there are a number of slides that are divided geographically, and and you know we can consider her enormous heritage of these images as a thinking background is expressed by photograph. Next. We said before how Africa was extremely important for Denise, and when also she says, mine is an African view of Las Vegas. So this being radical in a way, and these early African experience first raises the polarity of the is and the ought. Here she writes, it was the is of the colony and the ought of the mother country, in this case, England. And the question was, what environment lies around us and how it is different from what the media of the dominant culture, mostly English, suggested it should be. And this, childhood and her youth in Africa, really this experience established a sensitivity for marginalized subculture and a respect for their aesthetic. Next. These are, of course, just few images where she documents the land, where she documents the culture, where she documents also the service housing. Next. And the population as, active part of the environment. Next. But what is very extremely interesting that what she searched in the African land is also, the communication aspect. And so, you from here, really, you can understand how in embryo, this intention to understand, I would say, the value and the presence of this aspect in the environment was incredibly already there. Next. And she documents, of course, also the modern South Africa, Johannesburg. It's impossible to show everything, but also I would like to underline the sophisticated way of, some zoom in images where, also here you understand how she works with, the contrast of scale, how you understand the environment without seeing too much, but just the relation between a detail of a building and the panorama of the city behind. Okay, next. Then, of course, from South Africa, she went to the Architectural Association in London. And in these photographs, it's interesting, as she writes also in her essay, she was influenced by, a lecture by Le Corbusier, titled, If I Had to Teach You Architecture, a lesson on functionalism of that time, where among other issues, Le Corbusier invites to go behind the buildings to where architects consider practicalities rather than aesthetic, and where you can find interesting things. And so this, Denise started to make photographs in London of, the behind the scene aspect of the city. Also here, paying attention to inscriptions as element of communication. Next. And of course, Venice, as we already saw, the vast space that corresponds to the Veld, or the vast space we find in Africa, the patterns, the dynamic aspect of the life, the birds in relation with the static aspect of the Piazza San Marco, and also the communication here in the interest of photographing, the umbrellas with inscription and so on. Next. And these African subculture are those that leaded her also to be interested in investigating the American subcultures. And so these is the famous acrobat composition, Santa Monica acrobats. It's a composed image of different image. And the Santa Monica Road, where you can understand how it's interesting for Denise also to highlight the juxtaposition of artificial and natural, the palmas, the architecture, and the dynamic of the street, of the cars. Next. Also here in Santa Monica, again, you see how, the incredibly, in some images, there is an incredibly interesting tension that allows us to read the architecture as a decorated shed already, and read the patterns as part of the entire environment, but also read the surfers as temporary makers of landscape and so on. So everything gathers together in a circular and perception of the environment, together with the traditional one. Of course, we have the hill, we have the California hill, the house on top of the hill, the road, the car, but then we have something that conventionally wouldn't have been analyzed. And so in these American subculture, in these American subcultures, she starts to, in the 60s, this is Los Angeles, she starts to, early 60s, to make photographs of the automobile observer, urbanized landscape, billboards, suburban settlements, visual effects of the advent of the automobile in the built environment. Next. And then leading, towards Las Vegas. This is an incredible image of the Mojave Desert that leads, to the Las Vegas. Someone defined it a thing in the middle of nothing. And this same person, I don't remember the name, is in Martino Stirli, the book, same person described his arrival to Las Vegas from nowhere, from this strip, arriving, and you start to see a billboard. And then you start to see a second billboard, and then you start to see a series and a forest of billboard. And this is the way you approach the city. Next. So again, what's American about American place? What is interesting, in these incredible photos that teach us a lot, viewing the Las Vegas, city during the day through the strip, with the strip as an element, that is dominant, the photograph, but also viewing the rear of the casinos and viewing, the fake aspect of these billboards. And also the photo of, Magritte, like the famous photo of Bob that shows his back as a Magritte, like, as we all know, it's from the rear, it's the desert behind the casino. So she's interested not only on the, generic aspect of the city, but she goes behind and she analyzes what hides, in a way, the city, what's hidden in the city. Next. And so this is what also Pia Eva was speaking about. So the strip from the car and experiencing the city in motion gives space to the dynamic quality, and some pictures of the Las Vegas studio when they just arrived in the 1968 in this city. Next, this is the famous photograph of the strip during the day from the car again. Next. And this is the strip during the night. And this double face of the city, it's so radical, so strong, is one of the typical quality of this place. Next. And so going back also what on the text that Denise wrote us, but and the famous question, what did we learn? I like very much among the many answers she gives, and the one she gave also in our introductional text, what we learned would show in the subsequent work. This was an answer to the many interviews she received, because it's too early to say. But she also answered, we saw a new open-mindedness that would enable us to act sensitively and receptively on social questions in architecture and lead us to a new aesthetic, a formal language less restrictive than that of the late modern architecture and tuned to the social and creative needs of our time. And also what is interesting, thinking about the influence of Las Vegas, is how they came back to Rome from Las Vegas. So from Rome to Las Vegas, and from Las Vegas back to Rome again. And starting to see some elements in Rome, but also in the old European city as elements that could be, in a way, depicted with the categories of Las Vegas, inscription on Roman walls or cathedrals, the chart cathedrals as a kind of billboard. Next. And so the last answer, what do we learn from Las Vegas? We, our generation, or the next future generation, can learn from Las Vegas. And here I agree very much with Sylvia Levin, a critic of architecture, architecture theory. And when she was interviewed in the 2019 on a congress whose title was "What is Relevant Today of Learning from Las Vegas?" And she described Denise and Bob Venturi attitude of the time, that was one of the deep and sophisticated minds working and managing with objects that were alien or incomprehensible. And what is relevant today, to point and encourage the question, what do I not recognize the value of, and what kind of tools do I need to develop in order to understand them? And so looking at the cover of this book that was just published by Stanislaus von Moos and Martino Stirli, that collects a series of essays of this symposium that was placed in the States quite several years ago, Architecture After Las Vegas, we can say that there is the suggestion is to having that eyes that see, or this original, keeping, this phrase as an origin of the Le Corbusier phrase, eyes that not see. And that's all. Okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think that now we have a first round of the sixth presentation of the speakers. I don't know if we have any question since we are a bit late, I will just give priority from some question from the public. So if you want to do some questions, just raise your hand with the button or write it in the chat. Otherwise, I think we can have a small comment and keep the debate between the speakers before going to the presentation of the exhibition. Okay, I will give the floor to Ricard Pie for a question, comment. Just a second. Okay.
Sí.
Okay, first of all, congratulations for your talk, because you have touched upon a subject that is dear to my heart. I'm one of the children of the post-war. In this case, more than the post-war, the architectonic post-war, which is organized with the text of Denise Scott Brown. I studied during the 60s, and therefore when I finish my studies, I see these scandalous books where Denise Scott Brown, Learning from Las Vegas, is no doubt the most important one. When we gather in order to organize this Congress, one of the problems we had is that our professors and friends who have other platforms of research and institutes, most of them are economists, geographers. There are no architects studying the world of tourism. And we were searching everywhere in order to find a text by an architect for research able to gather some of the subjects that we had placed on the table. And here we find what we call the book of Denise Scott Brown and Venturi, Learning from Las Vegas. So these books, in our case, were very dear to us, to Jose Maria and myself, who are part of the scientific committee, because later we will talk about the urbanistic planning of Plachadaro, and we started with the reading text of Scott Brown, thinking that we could develop this touristic piece from the book of Scott Brown. We were unable to do it because due to the problems presented by Denise Scott Brown and all the architectures work by Denise Scott Brown, and the problems that we encounter in Plachadaro were very different. So we discovered many other things, magnificent ones. The landscape, the tourism, we realized that we were practicing an activity that did not have its own theory. In any case, it was an experience that leads me to some reflection. I don't know if this is a question. Aren't we in face of a very American fact, Las Vegas? And the analysis, maybe it's also an approximation in which you have done an excellent work of deconstruction in order to discover different methodologies and specific basis for the work. I haven't done it because I've done other things, not in classic texts such as this one. And therefore, my first question will be, aren't we in front of a very American approach? Very American approach. And also when we decided, we encountered this small collective, which was recovering. This, when we encountered this, I decided to buy this book, and then I did it with a very innocent reading. I was surprised by the clarity of the text and how simple it was, how sincere, the capacity to explain things. And the second question would be, I found it difficult to find a reference to tourism. And on the other hand, many people think this is the object of the debate, because apparently they are not searching for an answer from a touristic perspective, but they think that tourism is just an extreme realization of a specific architecture, very symbolic, in which tourism is expressed in a very solid way. So we are in front of the best example to be postmodern. Therefore, these are more reflections than questions, because you know many things. And in a presential congress, I will invite you for a coffee in order to speak about all this and to debate all this, because we could debate it from the feeling that I felt at that moment, young students of architecture, in front of a revolutionary text that was very clear. And therefore, we wanted to build another architecture, which in this case, in the case of Barcelona, ended up being the architecture of the Pear Group. So if we know any drawing from that time, is Oscar Tusquets, who is drawing in order to explain a building which is similar to the one of Denise Scott Brown, but made by him. And these were the ones introducing some of the texts, both of them. Therefore, these are some reflections. If you want to comment on them, I understand, but of course, they are the object of another debate. How American this discourse is, learning from Las Vegas, the postmodernity of this discourse. This is the first step to what will be postmodernity in the US and all over the world, and the absence of tourism as the central object of debate, as an expression of a specific architecture. So that was not a question, just a comment. Thank you very much for your presentations. I will try to respond to some of these questions, but each one is for a doctoral thesis. In me, it's not a very American fact, because the example on which she's working is also American, of course, and of course this cannot represent the American stereotype that we see through the movies and all the information that we receive. But what the book is proposing is a working method. And as a working method, I think it's completely valid if what we are communicating is the working method in order to analyze the reality. And it's a working method which is too valid. We have not been able to introduce it well enough, but mainly this is, for me, useful. Everything is useful because this is a way of thinking, but the tools that she uses in order to translate all this information can be applied to the current reality. So to me, it's not very American, meaning that it cannot be extrapolated to another context. So the reference to tourism in the 60s, you know better than myself, and being in Las Vegas, I think that it's not very probable. Carolina or Pia can explain it better, because for us, we took a long time to identify this architecture as the tourism that we understand nowadays. And as far as that this is the beginning of the postmodern, I think that Denise Scott Brown will be very disappointed, because they consider that they are not the initiators of the POM, but the POMO came later. And this is something that in her text, or the first one I read after Las Vegas, having words, she says that, and it's a defense, saying that they are not the ones initiating this postmodern movement, and this is something different to what they started. I guess that I'm entering into a garden, because this would be a complete debate. But as far as the first question, whether this can be translated or not, I completely agree. Yes, it can. I don't know what the other people think.
Well, I am here at this debate, and I think there is, yeah, there are these instruments, and there's also certain articles and studies that explain very interesting things. For instance, the logics between the center and the periphery, and the sizes of the cities and everything. And we see how cities in their own beginnings, well, they're different in every place of the world, but today cities look much more alike. There's also a very interesting piece of work by Stefano Boeri in Italy about trying to find the differences between the south and the north, and certain things looked alike, even though, well, we know that the logics of the government and the territory are different and there are cultural differences, but in the end, it seems that we have a planning system and a result that is quite similar. The Strada Mercato and there are articles that talk about concepts that I translate very quickly into what Denise Scott Brown tells us about in learning from Las Vegas. The strada and the width of the street and all these things. And then with Pia, we have worked in projects here in Barcelona for some areas and lanes of the Meridian Avenue. And what we did is work with our current tools and using a methodology that she used to implement. So we discovered things. So instead of being interested by removing 1 or 2 lanes in Meridiana, it was all about how to cross that street and how to measure where people go and people want to cross and where people wish to cross and where there are more urban activities concentrated. Today, I think that we can move in with our current analysis systems for topology and geography, and we can measure much more. And we can even include some environmental variables. So this idea of what is not measurable is now different. We can verify things, and what I wanted to present in my talk was to explain the street with this complexity that we have. I'm not talking about the street the way we're used to understand it, but rather, not so much the facades, but rather this idea of a band. And regarding tourism, I think this is an open matter, especially in the times of COVID. And I think that other times will come and other tourism will come. And there's this idea of visitors and residents. We have to understand who are the ones who live the proximity and who are the ones who overlap this proximity, which are the visitors. And I don't know, we have to think about tourism in a way of those who come to the city to shop for something, but these are the issues that I would like to consider to understand the future and to understand tourism with a much more complex scale of values. There are people who come to Barcelona for the weekend, actually, and this leads to a reflection point. But this would be maybe another topic, one more layer for reflection.
Pia, you want to say something? Because I want just to say that we should go to our conclusion. So if Pia and Carolina want to add something, but then we will go to the expo presentation. No, Pia? Okay. Can you hear us? Or Carolina, if you want to add something, just feel free, and then we will go to the the exposition presentation.
I just want to add very briefly 2 things. I completely agree that this is a working method. How in learning from Las Vegas, as complexity and contradiction was, a working method for architects too. And so looking at buildings and learn from the buildings, no matter which building you look at. And for learning from Las Vegas, it's a question of, measuring things that you cannot, in a way, dominate with traditional tools of the discipline. It's not so different Las Vegas today in what happens at a different scale in our territory. Of course, not. It's completely different from our solid cities, but our territories are in a way loose in a way, as was Las Vegas in a way. And if I can say it's not only an American approach, it's a global approach. Let's think also today, which is the Las Vegas today. I'm thinking it comes in my mind is Dubai. No, Dubai is a solid city in the middle of the desert. So this is literally something that comes from that kind of structure. And so I think that lesson is important for us related to tourism, of course, when we think about our territories, when we think that our city now are territories. We don't have anymore the city that we can, dominate with our mind, that we can dominate as the ancient city, but we have territories in between the old cities. And so here the lesson of Las Vegas, I think, can be extremely important.
Yo solo quería hacer un comentario rápido que
I wanted to comment on something quickly. It's like a table tennis match, and I'm thinking about what Cartier was saying when he said that they tried to implement this when it came up. I think that the revolutionary charter at that time was too present, and today maybe we're seeing things from a different side, and maybe today we're having a different approach that is not so provocative as it used to be. And I think that the current perception has changed, and maybe I'm going to ask something, but maybe we would need a coffee to reply for this. Maybe if we had to implement this again, the results would be different, because before everything was so fresh that when it was implemented, it was like a bomb, whereas now everything is more contemporary. I think that if a book nowadays still gives so much food for thought, if you can still find so many nuances, well, maybe Denise has learned something from Las Vegas, but maybe we have not learned all that there was to learn from Las Vegas, as Denise would say.
Okay, if there are not any question from the public, I was only thinking to go to the presentation of the exposition, which will give continuity to this dialogue in order also to formalize and to see this short preview. So one more time, if there are some question, you can just raise your hand or write a question in the box. Anyhow, if you want to think about it during the expo presentation, we can go back to the question after the expo presentation. In the meanwhile, I would like to thank the speaker of this roundtable, Eva Alvarez, Carolina Vaccaro, Pia Fontana, and Miguel Mayorga. And I will introduce the speakers of this expo presentation, which is Josep Maria Torra, del Col·legi d'Arquitectes de Catalunya, Delegació de Girona, Jeremy Tenenbaum from VSBA Architects and Urban Planning, and Pia Fontana, which is the curator of the exposition and from Universitat de Girona. I will leave the floor to these new three panelists so we can go through the exposition, and then in case we can come back to other questions and other issues which we have left unsolved.
yo voy a compartir una pantalla compartida para los tres, pero
I'm going to share one screen for the three of us. Jeremy, are you here? Because today there was a very nice piece of news. It seems that Denise Scott-Brown contacted with Jeremy Tenenbaum, and she sent a recording, but it's not a very good quality of recording. Maybe, I don't know if you can read this, Jeremy,
Her message?
as an introduction.
Yes, please. Hello, everyone. Denise sends this message. To everyone at the Touriscape 2 Symposium, hello and welcome. You ask, what did you learn from Las Vegas? An early answer was, what did you learn from the Parthenon? Meaning, what we learned is not easy to define. Another was that we learned to update architecture's precepts, its good precepts, for today, just as our forebearers, the early moderns, learned to roll with the punches and changes of their society and devised a new beauty. I've re-asked this question throughout my life, and answers include that communication is one of the functions of architecture, and with it comes symbolism. And that agonized beauty and laughing rather than crying are an essence of architecture. How will you answer this question? Think about it during this symposium and prepare to discover and add your own principles. I've said nearly all I have to say, but you can work on learning for your own time from Las Vegas. Denise Scott Brown.
Okay, Josep Maria, so I'm going to move the slides.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. And greetings from Denise Scott Brown. She wants me to let you know how grateful she is that you're having this conversation today. She's very, very honored. Let me start by saying, next, please. Let me start by saying I am not an architect. I work for VSBA Architects and Planners. We are the next generation of Venturi, Scott Brown, and Associates. I am not an architect. I am a poet. But for many years, I've worked with Denise and Bob Venturi because they needed poets as much as they need architects, apparently. I'm thinking also about tourism. During this conversation, when we've asked questions about tourism, I remembered a story from when I had no job. I was unemployed and I interviewed for a job in advertising. And I had nothing to show them. I had no experience. I said, I am a poet. And they said, in advertising, we need poets. And Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown needed poets also. I didn't get the job with the advertising, but fortunately, that's good for Denise and Bob. So I'm about to show you some photos that you've seen before in this presentation and that you might see later. But my hope is to show you a slightly different way of looking at them, a little bit how Denise looks at them, and a slightly different view of Denise herself. This is a photograph of Denise photographing herself in Las Vegas in the 1960s. And in a way, it's like children photograph themselves. They learn about their own bodies. They learn about themselves. And of course, it's a selfie. It's a selfie from the 1960s. Next, please. So Denise calls her way of looking at the world her wayward eye. And there's a pun in English because I means I and it means self. And so she's commenting that the way she sees things is a little strange and that she herself is a little strange and has an outsider perspective, a liminal perspective, that she's a slightly outsider character, having been from these other cultures, but also because of who she is as a human being. She teaches through biography, through stories. She doesn't speak in academic terms of theory, although she can do that too. She talks about her life and where she's been and what she's seen. And photography is a wonderful way of showing what she has seen. So that's why she took thousands of photographs over time. She loves the idea of the innocent eye. We've talked about the innocent eye today, but it's really hard to untrain yourself to see the world the way not just children do, but the way that other cultures do. The innocence is not an emptying out. It's a dislocation of self so that you can see it from other perspectives. But as Bob would say, innocence can be perverted too. It can be strange. It can be difficult. It could be angry. It can be what he calls and what Denise calls perverted, which I like. It's a fun term. Next, please. So they took photographs for a lot of reasons. Denise started taking photographs in South Africa just to document where she was and what she saw, and because it was fun. It was fun to take photographs. Over time, she took photographs because it was a way of recording where she had been, to use as a teaching tool, to use as a record keeping. She might not ever go back there again. And then over time, when they had built projects as a way of documenting projects, both for teaching and for advertising the firm and other reasons. Here they are in Las Vegas. You've seen this photo many times. And they're having fun. The lesson I take from this photograph is that they are playing a game together, like children. They've just fallen in love a few years ago. And here they are discovering Las Vegas, and they're learning to fall in love with Las Vegas, which is a terrible thing to do. Real architects do not learn from Las Vegas because it's not what responsible architects do. But they are playing, and they're right here. They're pretending that they're buildings because it's fun. And at the same time, it's a serious game. In fact, they had a great game called I Can Name Something Uglier Than You and Love It. And it's a way, again, of dislocating your your biases, your prejudices. We know that certain things are beautiful and certain things are ugly, that certain things are high culture and certain things are terrible. But can you look at the terrible things and say, that's terrible, and then say, but I can love it, but I accept it, but that's part of the world, and I'm building for this world, and I don't have to choose sides. And that's a great game for anyone of any age. Children do it naturally, but adults have to learn to play that game. Next, please. So again, photographs that you've seen before, one in Piazza San Marco in Venice and one at Venice Beach, California. And she's looking at natural systems. How do birds create patterns? How do birds use the Piazza San Marco? Let's look at things from a worm's eye view and from a bird's eye view. How do they use the space? How do they use the ground? At the same time, how do human beings use the air over the beach in Venice Beach? How do they make forms? But how do they, like birds, how do they fling themselves into the air to use that? What's the functionality of it? It's a good question. Next, please. They also use photography as an exploration of human systems. And here we're looking at housing in South Africa. So we're asking, what are urban systems in South Africa? What are urban housing systems in different parts of the world? But at the same time, we're asking, what are the economic systems that give rise to these physical patterns? What are the urbanistic systems? What are the social systems? What are the sexual and gender dynamics that and power relationships that create these patterns? And that is not simply physical, obviously. That is topological, that is natural, that is a reflection of human society and different forms of human society. So when Denise sees this, she sees all of the systems that gave rise to it, the river, but also the way that human beings organize themselves in that society, what they're willing to live with. And this is not that far from Levittown in America, in Pennsylvania. It reflects, how do people see their lives and how do they relate to each other, and how does that give rise to physical form? Next, please. Communication. Denise and Bob loved to learn from early modernism, but they added to early modernism this concept of communication as function. It performs a function, and it's a complex function. It gives rise, it requires symbolism and iconography and a variety of different things. And all of these are layered one atop the other, just as the systems were layered in the last image. So one question is this a cacophony? Is this too busy to understand? Is this too loud? Are there too many signs shouting at you? Well, Denise and Bob would argue, no, we know how to read this sign. If we're looking for a hotel, we can find the hotel sign. If we're driving down the road, we can see the road signs. If we're driving to the distant mountains, we can see that as a sign in a distance. We can read this environment and pick out what we require, even though it seems very loud, even though it seems very obnoxious. But there's a validity to this mess. This mess did not come along because some architect decided that they loved many signs or that they wanted to create this effect. It's an urban process of communication, and it's valid. It doesn't need to be cleared away. Mess is not an illness to be cured. Next, please. And so we're seeing a different culture's use of communication in their own architecture. This is in South Africa, the Mapak tribe, whom Denise met and learned from when she was living there. And here we see how they decorate the forms of their city with Western forms, adaptations and interpretations of Western forms. There are rectangular forms that look like Gillette razors. And they took these forms, these icons, and they made them into forms of decoration. In part because cultures overlap and they interact with each other and they adapt from each other and learn from each other. And this is, and just as you'll see so many Roman and Greek forms in Las Vegas, and we don't question that because there's a rationale to the beauty of ancient Rome and the importance. And here we're seeing a different culture adapt Western forms, and there's a validity to that. Next, please. Here we see again vast space, but we also see intimate space. The one on the left is the Mojave Desert in California. The one on the right is a storefront on South Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And in the left, well, Denise, when she traveled around the country, she doesn't really drive. I don't know if she's ever driven a car. I'm sure she must have at some point, but she hasn't driven in decades. She took buses. Everywhere she took buses and public transportation. And you see the world this way. You go right to the front of the bus and you get your camera and you photograph, or out the back of the bus. And you learn about how the bus moves through space, but you also see it from a car eye perspective. But she also was a great walker of cities. And on the right, we see just some storefront that has this collection of junk. It's just garbage, but it's beautiful garbage. And it has a chiaroscuro effect, and it's art, and it has communication within it. And somebody created it, maybe semi-accidentally, but it has a beauty. And she sees both the worm's eye view and the bus eye view. Next, please, thank you. But now, how do all these systems come together? Denise, here, she's looking at urban forms. What are the grand electrical tower forms in the distance? What are the urban forms in the middle ground beyond the highway? What's the form of the highway? And look at one car within the highway. So we're looking at urban forms and topological forms, housing structures, so many different systems are connecting here, are juxtaposed. Is it a beautiful photograph? There are blurry parts of it. It could be more beautiful. She likes the aesthetic effect of the little red car in front. She loves little red cars. But what she loves about this photograph is not just its purity or its perfect framing. What she loves is that she sees these systems interacting with each other in tense ways that don't necessarily easily resolve themselves. They tug at each other and they push against each other. And here she sees those systems interacting, fighting a little bit, learning to adapt around each other. Denise and Bob don't call themselves postmodern. They call themselves mannerist, like the 16th century art form. Mannerism in which you know all the rules, but the rules conflict with one another. You can't do all the rules, and so they fight with each other. And mannerism helps you figure out how to break the rules at the right time in the right way. This last photograph is just a beautiful photograph that she took in California of a group of young women in pink and another group looking at them. And she continues to take photographs with her iPhone now. She takes photographs of her home, her lawn, her decor, her bathroom, all of her toys, so to speak. In the end, even after you learn all these systems and you love them and you think about them intellectually and academically, on some level, you still have the right to, she says, to be yourself, to love what you love. Here's a photograph that she just loved. She took the photograph before she knew why she was taking it. She has often said that the Las Vegas of 1960s is long gone, but there are other Las Vegases, to learn from. There are other cities and towns and neighborhoods, your own house, your own self. In a way, learning from Las Vegas is least about Las Vegas. It's learning to learn from the world and from all the people of the world and from yourself within that world. And in the end, as she would say, just shoot, after learning all the rules, trust yourself and trust that you can see beauty and resolve all of these tensions within yourself. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm going quick because we're running out of time. And Rico is already telling us that production is going to end soon. So together with Josep Maria, and this is an invitation for the future, we want everything to be on site because it's not the same online and on site. And the meaning of all this is that, of course, everything was ready for you to come a few months ago, plans have changed. And there's an anecdote that we shared with Josep Maria. The pictures arrived when it was very difficult for them to arrive. They reached home. One of them was even water because it had been raining. So it was like a miracle that the pictures reached here just at the beginning of the pandemic. So the idea is that the exhibition took place in Girona and then it was shown here and everything was one event after the other. We've done it in a reverse way. So this is an invitation for you to come and we can see it in presence because it's not the same to see something in the computer or online. So that's all we wanted to say because the role of photography for Denise is very clear in all this exhibition. And I think that everything will be redundant now. I would like to explain the genealogy of this exhibition, which is very interesting. A collaboration between 4 people with Josep Maria as representative of the COAC and all the team working there, of course, and with Jeremy, Andre Ramirez, and also with myself. And just an anecdote, this exhibition was born when we were having lunch together. The exhibition of Leonardo Finotti just ended. We were having lunch in Girona together with Miguel, and we saw online an exhibition of Denise Scott Brown of these 10 photographies in London. And we were curious and we contacted to see if we could bring it here. And this was something which apparently was very difficult to do. And we contacted with Plant Site, Andres Ramirez responded. And at the beginning, we were going to bring these 10 pictures. But then we also talked to Jeremy and we started having different conversations. And finally, we decided that instead of organizing another exhibition, the Rebel Eye of Denise, we wanted to make it into an exhibition talking about the value of photography and dialogue. So we had the idea to associate a new selection of photographies, as Jeremy already explained, was done together with Denise, and then it was called Traveling with Denise, because in a way, the new selection allow us to have a wider perspective and a gaze, allowing us combining different narratives compared to the initial one. Obviously, the exhibition wouldn't have these photographies only. There are a series of objects which can be placed here. And I wish that Josep Maria can explain us. We are trying to do something quite a bit provoking to place some neon elements, postmodern. I don't know if we would be able to do it. It's going to be very difficult, but we can talk about it. In the exhibition, it can be seen outside the city, together with the spirit which was proposed by Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. So simply, besides showing these pictures that have already been shown during the first exhibition, which are well known by all of us, and we will exhibit some of them, some that have not been seen so often. And in this sense, it is important to take into account that the physical object of photography is also important. And of course, we will dedicate ourselves now with time, when we will have this physical montage, to play, as Italo Calvino was suggesting. I don't know if you know this book, The Castle of the Neighbors, where Il Castello del Destini in Croati, where he thinks about the tarot game as figures that can be combined in infinitive ways to create narratives. So what we will do with the 24 pictures plus the objects, we will introduce some combinatory machine, some narrative for us to explain something else, or maybe to insist in things that have been mentioned today and probably have created some expectations for them to come, for you to come. And of course, the presence of these 2 images, we have thought of a game with a silhouette. I'm not telling you everything, and that's it. And then we will have a beautiful video by Denise that will invite us to visit, and we will show it when we open the exhibition. I don't know if Josep Maria would like to say anything else, or since you are the host there in Girona, and we hope that it can be an itinerary exhibition. We will prepare a whole package, and I hope that it can circulate once again. That's all. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Pia. Thank you, Jeremy and Josep Maria. And unfortunately, I have the role of having to stop the time, but the interpreters have been with us for 12 hours and they need to rest. So I thank you for everybody, Alvarez, Carolina, Vaccaro, and then the presentation of the exhibition with Pia Fontana, once again with Jeremy and Josep Maria Torras.